Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to IVI's first webinar of 2021, Principles of Good Value Assessment. We are so pleased that so many of you were able to join us today. My name is Erica Defer-Malik, and I am the Director of Membership at the Innovation and Value Initiative. Today, we are going to be having a conversation with Jennifer Bright and Alan Balch about these principles. Oh, we're so glad to see both of you. I wanted to just do a housekeeping items before we get started. The first is that this is a dialogue, so if you have questions or comments, please post those in the chat function, and we will do our best to either respond to you individually as well as share them with the larger group when we get to the discussion portion of our conversation today. Also, we will be sharing an evaluation of our webinar today, and we encourage you to fill it out so we can continue to improve the programming that IVI provides. Great. Again, thank you so much for being with us today. And without further ado, I'd like to present to you Jennifer Bright and Alan Balch.
Good afternoon, everybody. Alan, are you?
Yep, I think I'm good. Sorry, everyone, to be a few minutes late. Had a computer
issue. Good to see you, and I'm excited for this conversation. I'm going to be running slides today, and I think you're going to kick us off with some background and help frame everything out.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to kick off the webinar here with a few background comments before Jennifer, you get into the principles for value assessment. And I'm proud to have been a board member for many years with IVI now and serving in various capacities with the Scientific Advisory Board and the Patient Advisory Committee. So it's been a great ride so far, and really excited about the future of IVI. You know, I think most of you who are on the call probably are familiar with IVI already and sort of the core principles of the organization, but happy to introduce, for those who may be new, just introduce you to those very quickly. The mission is obvious: to advance the science and practice and use of value assessment in healthcare. But I think the key is to make sure that when that's done, it's done in ways that are meaningful to multiple stakeholders. You know, those who receive the care, those who provide the care, and those who pay for the care. I think the emphasis here is on those who receive the care, which for many reasons have not been very active members of these types of endeavors, you know, to some degree because of they're complicated technically, economically, scientifically, but also because, you know, there's a lot of work to do for the patient advocacy community, and they have to think about where they invest their time. But I think there are a lot of patient groups now who are well positioned to participate as equal partners and co-equal partners in these endeavors. The process here is really to build a community to create those rigorous, innovative, and relevant methods in translational research to really make value assessment, whether it's at the individual level or at the population level, to make it meaningful for patients. And that leads to the next point about facilitating patient-centered value assessments, really, where, just like we say all the time in healthcare, the patient should be at the center. It should be about what matters to patients. Value assessment should similarly be designed around that North Star. And then emphasizing flexibility and usability for unique decision contexts of individual decision makers. So increasingly, there's not a one-size-fits-all, particularly if you think about an era of personalized medicine, where we are catering and we're trying to figure out how to orient treatment and screening and diagnostics around the unique biologic and other characteristics of patients. We also, that same idea of personalization has to flow through other relevant aspects of the healthcare system, including value assessment. Not that all value assessment has to be personalized, but I think it's becoming increasingly important to line up the idea of precision medicine and precision science across the scientific landscape, including the science of value assessment. Next slide. So a great method summit that IVI was privileged to host back in April. Jennifer can maybe provide more insights if it makes sense as she goes through the principles. But the big takeaways from that method summit, and the composition of the participants reflected the type of audience that I mentioned already in the previous slides, a multi-stakeholder audience representing those who receive the care, provide the care, pay for the care, deliver the care. But the main takeaways were about improving data input. So the value assessments are only capable of producing relevant information if the inputs and the data that form the basis, whatever the methodology is, the data has to be able to incorporate what matters to each of those stakeholders, especially patients. There's a lot of exploration of novel and augmented methods for evaluating cost effectiveness, but there's been a lot of discussion about the quality. And there are certainly other ways to evaluate value, if you will, and assess it beyond the quality, either augmenting the quality or other alternatives to the quality. Um, and then greater participation by all users, which is a point I already sort of emphasized already. Next slide. So I was privileged to be part of I guess a working group, if you want to call it that, an activity that was hosted by the USC Schaefer Center as well as the Aspen Institute to really and again comprised of multiple stakeholders, including the patient voice, to have a series of discussions about what the future of health assessment should be for the U.S. That white paper is available. There's a link to it at the bottom. This was a compromise document. It's not meant to represent the opinions or perspectives of the organizations that the people here represent. There really are a blending of different perspectives and ideas from the individuals who were part of this discussion. I think the bottom line is when you get a bunch of people in a room to try to figure out what's the right vision or path for health technology assessment in the US, it's hard to get to consensus. So there's a lot of middle ground here in the document. I think the one thing for which I think there was a lot of consensus was you can't just take a European style methodology, just borrow one and drop it in the US. Not because there's anything, I mean, every methodology and all have their pros and cons. I think just recognizing the fact that the US healthcare system is unique and that's known around the world. And so you also need a similarly unique value assessment framework if you're going to do anything at that federal level to reflect the uniqueness of the US healthcare ecosystem and the political economies around it. So I think it's some of the main takeaways from that is health assessment needs to be applied across different treatment modalities in different areas of healthcare, diagnostics, devices, drugs, etc. That stakeholder engagement, similar to what we've described already, was important to incorporate at all aspects of value assessment, and the transparency of methods and findings is imperative. And I think ultimately the vision here was an advisory type of organization that oversaw and expanded the horizon of value assessment, funded research, both value assessment itself, as well as the research behind how to advance different methodologies, different data inputs for value assessments, and then filling any gaps where the market may not be, where individual organizations in the market may not be filling important gaps in value assessments, particularly around things like devices and diagnostics, that maybe this organization would do its own assessments or fund those types of assessments directly. I hope I didn't go too far. Yeah, next slide. I hope I didn't take up too much of time already, Jennifer, for my part of this. But lastly, and this will set up, I think, Jennifer's, as she delineates the principles here. I think we all know that the opportunity or the window of time is now. There's a lot of attention being paid, obviously, to value assessment and how it might be more relevant in the U.S. healthcare ecosystem. These are just some examples of recent media stories that capture sort of the essence of that. It's time. It's time to really think about what the future is going to hold and make sure that we're thoughtful about where we go with value assessment, because it really can be a very positive thing, and also can be a tool for limiting access, and that may not be a bad thing if it's not cost effective, but it also could be a great tool for making sure that things that are really, really high value services get advanced and adapted more quickly with broad access. So there's a double-edged sword to value assessment. I think we all need to be aware of that, but I think there's a real opportunity to do something really positive with it, as well as there's also the risk of a negative or a downside to value assessment if it's done the wrong way. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jennifer to take you through the principles, and thank you for the opportunity to give some of this background on IVI and the broader context of value assessment in the U.S.
Thanks, Alan. Beautifully summed up. Hello, everybody. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to talk with you. I have a rather ambitious goal, and that is to cover 9. We didn't set out to come up with 9, but 9 principles that really capture what IVI stands for and where we are trying to lean in both methodologically and to elevate the conversation about value in the US for all the reasons that Alan shared. My purpose today is to not go too deep, but rather to clarify each of the principles, talk a little bit about how we've endeavored to incorporate those principles into the work that we've been doing for the last almost 4 years. And most importantly, where we see the possibility for impact, why is it important to us, why we think it should be important to others, and where we want to go. That's my purpose, to end my remarks on what's coming next as we look ahead to the year and even beyond that. And then hopefully, if I can do this quickly, then we have ample time for some dialogue. We would love to hear some questions and areas that you'd like to explore further. And Alan and I can riff a little bit about those questions, hopefully before the end of the session. So again, 9 principles. We didn't necessarily have that number in our mind when we set out to really articulate them. And they don't necessarily represent an order of importance, with one exception, and that would be our first principle. Both my personal true north, as well as I think the organization's true north, is really understanding what's authentic to patient communities living with different diseases. If we do a better job of understanding patient perspectives in value, what are the factors that they ascribe to a valuable treatment or intervention, and how do we bring that forward methodologically? How do we quantify it and be able to incorporate it into value assessment? Then we have a better shot at really understanding value truly from a patient-centered perspective. And so that's really our primary principle here. When we talk about the ways that we do that operationally here at IVI, there's 2 aspects to that. One is obviously from a governance and participation. We have a growing membership of patient organizations, and I'm super thrilled to see so many patient communities represented on today's call. But membership is just one aspect of it. It's also about board leadership. It's about contributing to our Patient Advisory Council, which we started last year, which is an advisory board to the board of directors. And the Patient Advisory Council has been an enormous asset to us in thinking through how do we improve the authenticity of what we're doing in patient engagement. How do we, what communities can we reach out to better understand patient perspectives in different patient communities? How do we grapple with the challenges of representativeness in patient research? All of those things are ones where we're actively in dialogue with our council members for their advice, their expertise, their connections to point us in the right direction. And then we also have advisory groups that help us not only discern what disease states should we be spending some time exploring, concepts of value, patient preferences, things like that, but also actually brass tacks advisory input to our model development. And I'll give you an example of where we're working on that in the area of major depression along the way here. And the other aspect is, so one side is more process, the other side is really how we conduct our research. We are very dedicated to this concept of understanding value through the eyes of lived experience. And We have done that already in the development of our conceptual models in non-small cell lung cancer, as well as rheumatoid arthritis. And we're currently in the throes of doing so for our next model in major depressive disorder. And, that's beyond just do a focus group. It's really exploration of what is the literature, what are patient communities really struggling with, where is there opportunity to draw in existing data that may not exist in randomized control trials. And I think one of the biggest learnings we've had over the last 4 years is that there's huge opportunity to pinpoint where the data isn't yet supporting things that actually matter to patient communities. And this is a big reason why we spend so much time on this, because if we are having a conversation about value through using tools like value assessments, and we are not talking about the correct inputs, we are missing the forest for the trees. And I think we are very likely to make some decisions about resource allocation, about pricing, that are not aligned with factors that really matter to the patient communities who are on the receiving end of these decisions. So if for no other reason, that is the reason we are spending so much time thinking about how do we better represent patients inside value assessment. So the second principle is also something that I think is core to IVI, and that is transparency. We've said from the get-go, from the inception of this organization, that in order to really have a balanced conversation about value, we have to open the dark corners. We have to open the black box and look inside and see what the assumptions are, where the assumptions are not perfect, where we don't have good data. And we have to be transparent about that. In order to have an open dialogue, we have to be completely transparent with what we're doing. So this is central to our work. As I said, we founded the Open Source Value Project with this in mind, so that there is not only process transparency in the form of public comment and documentation, but also the mechanics of the prototype models that we've built. The coding is available. The literature that is its basis is open for rigorous viewpoint. We put everything we do out for public comment and incorporate that feedback back into updates of the model, which we just came through updates to both of our first prototypes in non-small cell lung and rheumatoid arthritis. So and there's a growing trend here. We are not the only ones that are beginning to talk about the need for wider use of open source modeling. ISPOR has its own special interest group that they're developing in this area. There is enormous opportunity within the field of health economics and outcomes research to really push the envelope and really talk about how can we open up modeling and make it something that's iterative, truly, so that we're not constantly creating one-off proprietary models that everybody can quibble with what the different assumptions are and the technical approaches to it. And we're not really fostering a true learning environment in that scenario. So we think that there's enormous opportunity, and we're really pleased to say that IVI has been a champion from the get-go, and we will continue to be so, to set a new bar, if you will, for how we should go about this conversation. Third, cultivates modernized methods. What do we mean by that? We've grappled with the language of this principle quite a lot. There's a lot of debate here in the US, and Alan alluded to it, about the methods that we're using and whether, is the quality outdated? I'm not getting into that debate today, but what we want to say is that there are multiple tools, and there are growing examples of methodologies that have scientific merit, and that we need to have a better understanding of how they are working together in order to fill in the picture of value. So we want to be able to talk about how value assessment can incorporate societal perspectives. How can we look at broader cost parameters than just the cost of the individual intervention or pill or device? How can we address the issues that are very much top of mind in terms of discrimination? How do we make sure we really don't hard code equity issues? And there's a related principle further on this list. And then also, how do we really understand patient heterogeneity inside of a value assessment model? We can't deal with every permutation, but there is a robust community of scientists that are really exploring exciting new ways to think about how we measure and evaluate value. And we should be open to that, and we should be actively exploring which of those things fit together, like a puzzle. So like I said, OSVP has really been a laboratory. That's the way we work. Oftentimes, I think in my early days here, I was asked, well, what is IVI? And we're not a mini ICER. We're not trying to put every drug or device through these, these widgets to give an answer. What we are is a laboratory to really explore how can we do this better. So things like, how can we look at multi-criteria decision analysis as an amplifying or complementary approach to decision analysis? How can we account for heterogeneity by looking at the ability to make flexible parameterization within a model? And how can we look at subgroup analysis? How can we incorporate novel methods like insurance value and some of the other methods that were brought out by the 2018 S4 special panel? And we've done so in our first two prototypes, and we're wanting to push even further into our next model, thinking about things like distributional cost effectiveness analysis, which really seeks to get at some of these equity and socioeconomic issues. So this is what we mean when we say modernize the methods. We have to be horizon thinkers. Number four, really expanding our discussion about value across treatment interventions. If we stay focused, I think all the headlines that you saw earlier on the slide that Alan put up talk about drugs, and drug pricing is certainly top of mind to many. And as it should be, it's a challenge, and especially when we have limited resources, and made even more so by our economic crises and as a result of this pandemic. But if we are not working towards pushing the value conversation to really look across our investments in health, then I don't believe that we are really lifting our eyes. And so one of the ways that we are doing that now, and this is more prospective than anything I can point to that we've done thus far, but we purposely undertook this next model prototype in major depressive disorder because we saw an opportunity to widen the conversation and look across treatment modalities, not just pharmaceuticals, to really understand what has impacts both on this disorder for the consumer community, for families, but also for the clinical and employer payer communities as well. We also think it's important, and this is something that we've endeavored to do in the first two prototype models, is to talk not just about comparison of treatment A versus treatment B, but thinking in concept of sequences of treatment. So we're working to use clinical guidelines that exist to model first through fourth line, for example. And this gets into some of the more technicalities on the economist side of things. But I think the thing I want to leave you with is that we think it's important to really think about examining sequences of treatment when we talk about cost effectiveness analysis, and not just A versus B. The fifth is the opportunity to improve clinical and real world data. So as Alan said, it was actually almost a year ago today that we held the first method summit. And the number one takeaway was that everybody in the room, payer to patient, agreed that we don't have good data. We are making decisions without really having excellent contextual data at our fingertips that tells us how do things happen in the real world and what really matters, what's the priority. But the number one thing I also heard was that we can't include everything. We have to understand where the gaps are that really matter, and what are the most important data elements that need to exist, perhaps disease agnostic, so across disease states. How do we really get at improving the ecology of data that's used to consider value without really leaning in and identifying where the gaps are and where there's missed opportunity? So personally, I think that value assessment, one of the possibilities or opportunities with value assessment writ large, is to really identify where those gaps are, and then use that as a way of discussing how do we incentivize research? How do we invest in research that's really going to answer questions that are important to patients? And if we don't consider value assessment as having that feedback loop, then I think we are doomed to just constantly be using the garbage in, garbage out principle of our conversation about value. And so this is actually just sums up what I just said. Examples in RA and non-small cell lung, a good example that cuts across many disease states is functioning and independence as conceptual priorities for patients. That is not unique to just rheumatoid arthritis, but the measure, how do we measure those concepts? Do we measure those concepts? And then how do we quantify that and use it in our calculation of whether a therapy or a sequence of treatment has true value to the patient, and also by extension, cost effectiveness of achieving a certain state of wellness. So these are the things that we really need to dig into, and there is an opportunity to improve the ecology of data being used. Number 6. Facilitates customizable decision-making. So by this, we're talking about the fact that an individual decision maker, whether it's an employer purchaser or an insurance company, or even, dare I say, sometime in the distant future, when we can get to using tools like this to help guide clinician and patient shared decision-making. We're not there yet, but we can hope. But decision makers' needs at a given time differ based on population, based on the cost question on the table, based on the disease state. And we think that value assessment tools and methods should be able to support some flexibility there. We can't make everything the N of 1, but we should be thinking about how do we make these resources available in a customizable way that allows adaptation. Again, my point being, if we create all these proprietary, siloed, rigid, kind of set models, are we really fostering a learning environment where we can talk in a broader sense about what value has and how it evolves over time, depending on the particular question that you're posing? So our existing work, we've endeavored to do that. We've done in both our first 2 prototypes, we've created the ability to flex the parameters of the model and the inputs. That allows the user to really customize their decision case that they're trying to explore. Is it perfect? No. Are we putting it out there and asking for real-time input and testing and what can we learn from that? How can we improve it? Absolutely. That's part and parcel of the OSVP ethos and the work that we're doing. But we recognize that not every decision maker is going to need to look at the models in quite the same way. And so we believe that it's very important to allow decision makers to be able to adjust the parameters to fit their needs. And that's what we mean by localized decision making. 7, adapts to and with evolving evidence. So again, this is part of our open source model project, the idea that we know that science is constantly evolving. We want to be able to make sure that we can analyze concepts like scientific uncertainty. That's when, how firm are we, how sure are we that the evidence that's available really does reflect the real world. How do we grapple with issues around patient heterogeneity, especially when we are looking at data that may not be reflective of that heterogeneity, and whether it's race and ethnicity, gender, disease experience, that kind of thing. And so we need to think about how we build these tools so that they can be adaptable over time. So one of the ways that we've done that is, the OSVP ideal is that these models can grow over time. They can be adapted, they can be both methodologically improved, but they can also take in emerging data inputs, because think of them as more as shells rather than a black box input. And we also deliberately built them so that they can evaluate scientific uncertainty. So how sure are we that the scientific evidence really gives us the right picture? So these are very technical concepts, and we are interested in exploring them. I don't think that we have come to definitive answers or a perfect way of doing it, but that wasn't our purpose. We really are putting these concepts out there with the idea of gathering others who are interested and willing and ready to lean in and explore how we better utilize these concepts. Number 8, I mentioned before. So this one we felt really important to put out there separately. It's not just about understanding subgroups of patients and things like that, but really, in my view and at IVI, our view is that value assessment should ultimately support achieving health equity. If we can facilitate the ability to do subgroup analysis, if we can talk about improvements in methods and ensure that we adequately represent patient preferences inside the research, we have a better shot of actually yielding insights and incentivizing both policy and payment policy that supports equity. In my view, when I read these articles about let's create a centralized entity, and not to disagree with Alan or his colleagues from the USC conversation, but my personal worry with a centralized entity that is comfortable with one methodology, or that we've already figured out what's the best way to arrive at these answers, is that we actually run the risk of hard coding existing disparities that we all know exist in the system, whether it's from payment or deliveries, from research, and even in our own work already this year in exploring patient attributes and patient perspectives on value in treatment of major depression. One of the things we've come up to, which many in the research enterprise confront, is how challenging it is to make sure you have a representative patient sample. And I'm not just talking about race and gender and age. I'm also talking about socioeconomic status. I'm also talking about people who are not technologically connected, and how you make sure you understand the differences, the cultural competence side of understanding their experience in care and what they value is so imperative. But it's hard. It's hard work. It's time consuming. It's complex. And because of that, I think we really need to have a wider conversation about how we improve the methods of doing so and how we make sure we represent that diversity inside of value assessment. So this area in particular is more on the formative end. It's an area that we're interested in exploring further in a meaningful way. We're also interested in exploring, how can we bring in novel methods like distributed CEA in our upcoming model, looking at things like the Medicaid perspective. Can we understand public payer as opposed to private payer perspectives? Is that important? Does that show us something different? These are the kinds of questions that we're interested in exploring through our research. And at long last, I made it to number 9. Of course, we need to make sure that in the process of, what did I do? in the process of exploring, are we paying for value, we need to also find that balance point in making sure that we are incentivizing innovation. I drew this principle primarily from our experience in working with ISPOR last year to host a series of really excellent webinar dialogues around the impact of COVID-19. What was the impact on the conversation about value assessment and HTA in the US, but also globally? And one of the things that came up throughout all 5 of those sessions is that we have to find that balance point with all these transformative therapies. So we can think about it in terms of cell and gene therapies, rare diseases, the next, God forbid, the next pandemic. We need to have a wider national dialogue about where's that balance point between paying for value and ensuring that we have innovation to truly transform health. And so we have to, I debated about whether to make this a principle because it seems a given, but I think it's something to keep top of mind in all of this work, that we can get really down in the weeds about what the mechanics of a value assessment, but to me, this is one, along with equity and patient centricity, this is one of those top line values that we need to make sure we don't forget about along the way. So, and I just said all of that. So, so I want to conclude before we wrap a little bit about some of what I said. Now I've told you what we've done and what we're currently doing, and then what's ahead for us in 2021. First, I will say that I'm super excited that as of Monday, IVI will have a chief science officer at the helm, and we're super thrilled to invite Rick Chapman to join our team and help us think through these issues, as well as help me to conceive of kind of what's the event horizon, what are the next things on our ambition list. But some of the ways that all of you in the audience can get involved with IVI are things that we have cooking, where engagement and public dialogue is going to be really important. One of the things we did this year was to launch a webinar series. This is the first in what we hope is a list of many. We're turning our attention to this issue of equity and value assessment and really getting at the brass tacks of how do we improve that, what are the challenges, and we're looking forward to hosting that in April. A date has not been finalized, but we'll be coming back to you and others with that shortly. The second is, I mentioned the MDD model. Glad to answer any questions about that, but one of the first opportunities is going to be a public comment period on the scope of the model, which we hope to do sometime March, April timeframe. The public comment period is really important to us. We want to hear what we have right. We want to hear where there's data points that we may not know about that we need to make sure we incorporate. We want to hear about what the challenges are from a decision maker standpoint. What are the questions you really want to better understand, and how can a value assessment model help you do that? We also have a series of panels and workshops at the ISPOR meeting coming up. So this is another opportunity for us to bring forward some novel thinking, and not just from within our ranks, but across many organizations, patient and scientists. So we're looking forward to bringing that to the fore. And then later this year, we are planning to host our second annual Method Summit. This is building off of what Alan talked about, our learnings from last year, and we left you a link for the report. So I would urge you to go and read what we learned last year. And one of the chief things, again, was how do we understand how to measure patient priorities, and what are the methods that we're using? What are the ways that we're going to be able to better articulate what factors are important to patients? And most importantly, how do we methodologically begin to incorporate those into our value assessment processes and our mechanics? These are not easy questions. We know we're being ambitious in tackling them, but we are both going to be bringing together a multi-stakeholders steering committee to help us design this program. and also be welcoming and a participatory audience. And anybody who was at our summit knows there's work. We have surveys, we have small groups. It's very interactive because we want to get to some answers and to some sense of what next. What are the actions that we can take that will measurably move the field forward? So with that, I'm going to conclude. I mostly stayed on time, so I'll get some kind of reward, colleagues. So I think I cannot see chat, so maybe Erica or Alan, if you can see some of the questions that have come. Yeah.
So we have the first question that is coming from one of our colleagues in the field who has done a lot of value assessment in the past and has really faced the challenges of how there's a lack of data and that there's a lack of appropriate data for value assessment. So the question really is, how do we start the feedback loop and request that researchers, manufacturers, government funders, et cetera, are generating the data that we can use? So what is the feedback loop that we can do on a policy level to really encourage better data?
Well, I'll give you my opinion. I'm happy to have Alan weigh in, you know, as his role with his organization, I'm sure he has some specific ideas as well. You know, I would say that right now the primacy of the peer-reviewed publication is something that slows down this feedback loop, in my view. I'm not suggesting that it doesn't have its purpose, but I think that it takes us such a long time to get papers back into that channel that really talk about what the data gaps are and where there's opportunities for investment in research, that it slows us down. I also think those are not the most attractive papers all the time. So I think collaboration is a big way to improve this conversation about where the data is really missing. We are collaborating now with the National Health Council, with Every Life Foundation, and some others on a broad initiative to really talk about impact. So what are core impacts that really address patient perspectives across disease states, and how can we come to a common language and an understanding of where we need to build and improve the flow of data. I think also there's an opportunity with this change in administration. I think there's a wider receptivity to both the needs and voice of patients, but also the importance of science. So I think that if we can be louder and more concrete about where there are gaps in science that really are not well serving patients, I think that may gain more attention. But that, yeah, so that's my opinion. Alan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would just, I would add, I agree with those sentiments. And I think it's a great question, and that's sort of the $20 million question, or 20 bill, whatever denomination you want to put to that. I would offer two thoughts here. One is, you know, in my experience with these discussions, the two places where I think where there's data missing is around, you know, and these are issues across the healthcare spectrum. So I think if we can solve these two problems, we're going to solve problems in other areas, whether it comes to value-based payment models, clinical pathways, quality measurement, you know, any number of things I think suffer from this data issue. And the two places where I think we really could move the needle is better outcomes measurements. And both of these have to do with putting the patient at the center and thinking more about person-centered outcomes, patient-centered outcomes. So routinely we hear or we see outcomes that we know are not the best way to measure outcomes, particularly for specific patient populations or even sub-patient populations. So that's a key. So, and I don't, you know, we could have a whole day, 2 weeks on just that topic alone. So I won't go far down that rabbit hole. But I think that's a starting point, is figuring out, you know, where we can identify better outcomes, and to measure those, and that then gives you a set of data, right, to think about measuring quality. And then second, and somewhat related to that is, what are the patient data variables that we really need? And they're not going to be perfect, but I think there needs to be some consensus about what are the 4 or 5 pieces of data we really need. And it's not going to be the best data for every scenario, but some of the things that routinely come up that are, say, contextual considerations, if you think about an ICER review, which I understand that approach, and it makes a lot of sense to me given the limitations now with data. But things like transportation, caregiver burden, work disruption, those come up commonly. And those do impact, for many patients, their clinical journey and their ability to adhere to and successfully complete a treatment regimen. And there are many treatments that differentiate on those variables in ways that are meaningful to patients. So I think if we could come to some consensus about what are the 4 or 5 key sets of data we really need to collect from the system, I think then you can start to see where are the places you could get those data in a rigorous fashion. And patient advocacy groups like mine and many others are becoming way more sophisticated about being able to collect data from patients, real world data that could be aggregated and used as inputs into these models. We're not there yet, but that's where we could use a partner. We're not data scientists or experts. We have a few on staff, but not enough. So I think that's where groups like IVI and others and academic institutions really can be partners to those who have the data to figure out what data do we need to extract from your organization and the outreach you have to patients, and then how do we actually make those data sets available and put them into models is a whole other question. But I do think there's an opportunity to focus in on a handful of things that we know would make the analysis, even if you're using traditional methods. It is a lot of the input is the question. So if you can figure out how to engineer some of those into existing methodologies, you would at least be advancing the field. I will say one thing, Jennifer, not to be argumentative, but in the Aspen Institute paper, the goal was to be methodologically neutral about what, if there was a value assessment done by a centralized body, that it would be, we didn't advocate a particular methodology, but the point was it wouldn't be wedded to a particular methodology, and there would be a lot of questions asked about what is the right methodology, what are the right data inputs, and of course, any reports would be disaggregated. There would be some outcomes information, and some of that may be in the form of a quality, but the goal wasn't to produce a sort of European style value assessment.
No, and we agree. Absolutely. Yeah, let me just clarify that comment. I think though that when you read, especially in common media, and more recently the allusion to the Biden administration thinking about adopting the German model. And I think what I'm saying is there's this kind of tone that will solve all our problems, right? If we just adopt a centralized model, we borrow somebody else's ideas, that we will solve the problem. And I think that's what I'm saying is that's a red herring. And we are going to miss a huge opportunity if we just adopt something without thinking about it first.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, and I would just say, to amplify, I couldn't agree with you more about those 2 elements that are really needed. And that's our hope, to really drill in on that in the summit later this year. So my hope is that by this time next year, we're talking about how, like, the robust kind of engine room that's starting to bubble about getting to the bottom of some of these things. I know it's going to take years, but my hope is that this time next year, what we're talking about is anticipating some results from this investment in better research. A girl can dream.
Jennifer, if returning to the questions about the HTA German style model, one of the participants would like to know what IVI's plans are in terms of responding if those are pursued. So does IVI plan to actively argue against any German style HTA models if they are pursued on the federal level or the state level for that matter?
So here's what I will say. IVI is a 501c3, so we're not a lobbying organization. And we have a small but mighty team, even with Rick joining us. So the fact that I think we would stand by and say that, we would like to actively push not to have just an adoption by reference approach to this. As far as active lobbying, especially at the state level, and I can say this from having spent 20 years working in state level policy, that's a bandwidth issue from an IVI standpoint. But we certainly support the notion that we have a lot of things we need to sort out and get on the same page about methodologically, data-wise, all the things we've been talking about during this webinar. We have to address those things very seriously before, if not in the context of exploring this notion of a more centralized entity. I hope that didn't sound like I was equivocating, but.
So Jennifer and Alan, as I know that you had said that there's 9 principles, and as you just pointed out, we are small but mighty. What are for our 2021, where are IVI's priorities in moving towards these principles?
Oh my goodness. Well, I think that through the work on the major depressive model, we're endeavoring to advance the patient centricity, the exploration of modern methods. And I think the notion of how can we improve clinical and real world data use. Those are the 3. And then, transparency is kind of inherent, but I would say those are the big ones. I'm sure my colleagues are chiming in saying, no, don't forget number 9 or whatever, but those would be my top 3. Alan, any thoughts there?
No, I mean, I can't. I don't want to speak for IVI. You did that. I think for us as an I can answer for our organization when we look at those principles. It's definitely number 1 for obvious reasons around patient centricity, and I think IVI and many other organizations I think are taking very seriously a desire and obligation to involve patients and think about how they do their work with patients and on behalf of patients and co-creation with patients. So I think there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of good work being done in that space across the board in the value assessment world. I would pick on 6, not because it's anything that's immediately in the future, but I think we have to differentiate between sort of value assessment at the population level and then value assessment at the individual level. And both are out there, right? So, you have the ASCO value framework. It was more of an individual level sort of value assessment type of tool. Never, it's still a work in progress. And of course, then you have other models that are clearly population based. And I'm not saying they're mutually exclusive or one's better than the other. I'm just saying I think there's a need for both. And actually, I think there's an opportunity to kind of marry the 2 in some weird way. So you can think about taking a clinical pathway and infusing into, which is really an individual-based decision-making platform, in infusing value assessment type of components into it so that you can actually figure out for this patient, is transportation a big of enough issue to differentiate between that mode of administration when figuring out whether this is the right treatment? When you think about cost, there are other factors to consider where where if you're just looking at drug costs, there may be an offset cost somewhere else for that patient that may make a treatment more expensive on paper or less expensive on paper. So I think there may be some, and this is down the road, but I think that when we talk about personalized decision making, and really thinking about how do you, it's not that you're going to be able to, you can't personalize a population health tool, but how do you take some of the best aspects of population health measurement, and infuse those into a personalized tool where most people get kind of say, this is the average patient for which this recommendation makes sense. You have a more objective and sort of quantitatively driven way or qualitatively driven way of determining who are those patients who really are the subpopulations for whom the assumptions don't work. And so now, now we say it's ALF pathway, or we use contextual considerations. That's another way to build that in, maybe not necessarily into the population health models, but more into, protocols that are used to make decisions at the individual level.
Yeah, I agree with you. And of course, you're near and dear to my heart for your horizon thinking. And I very much agree with you. There's a lot of opportunities. I was trying to keep some realism to the answer to that question, but I will also note, Rick joining us is a critical development for IVI, and I don't want to anybody on the phone to assume that that's the sum total of what we're doing. I'm looking forward to working with Rick to explore what should we be doing, where are there opportunities like what you just said, Alan, and where should we be leaning in, because that's really the ethos of this organization, is to look at what is and say, well, what should it be, and how most importantly, the how question, how do we get from where we are now to something better? That's really what this organization was founded to do. It's what we live every day, and it's what our team is very excited and committed to bringing into the world. So I note that we're coming up on the hour, so maybe we have time for one more question. What do you think, Ellen? Okay.
If you don't let me answer it, we'll probably get through it. I tend to be long-winded.
I think that one final question that I would like to share with you is really demonstrative, because we have Alan with us on the phone today. Is I'd really like to be able to share how partners and members play a role in IVI's work.
Alan, do you want to,
Go ahead. You're better positioned to answer that, at least operationally.
Yeah, like I said, well, IVI is a member organization, and by that we mean, members are not only kind of financial stakeholders in what we're doing, but they're also active, roll up your sleeves, get involved. So, our member organizations have an opportunity to weigh in on everything from the priorities, like what research projects are we going to prioritize, to who we invite to, sit with us on steering committees or advisory boards. Patient contributors are not only on our board, like Alan and Donna Pryor are both board members. We're including patients in our nominating committee. We're going to be nominating a new class of board membership, and so we're involving members in that. And then, when we get into the brass tacks of actually doing the work, we start every project with advisory groups. We seek a lot of input from patient communities. When we explored the notion of doing major depressive disorder, we first sat with a huge number of patient organizations to kind of query their input about disease states of interest, what, priority, who should be involved, those kinds of things. We did the same thing when we did the non-small cell lung model. We spent a lot of time with a variety of oncology organizations to discern where could we do something that's meaningful and has impact. So, and then I think, then we get down to patient participation in the actual research. So right now we're collaborating with a lot of patient organizations to help with recruitment, to help us think through recruitment, to help us understand what are best methods to engage with community organizations, with clinics, to reach people that are not traditionally reached in this type of research. And that, like I said before, it's time consuming and it's challenging, but it's totally worth doing. And we have discovered that time and time again. So we're just going to keep doing it. I hope that answers the question. Alan, anything to add?
Nope. I mean, I do, but I won't. It's 3 o'clock.
Thank you. There's no more questions right now.
Perfect.
Okay. Great. Well, I'll speak first and I'll let Alan close us out. I want to thank everybody. It's just such a delight to see such a diverse group of people joining us today. I hope that you heard something of interest. I actually, if you can see, I paused it, but maybe you can see now, here's all of the contact information for our team. You please reach out to any one of us to get a conversation started. We're happy to hear from you. In our view, if we all lean into this together, if we use my favorite analogy, if we all lean on the same oar, we believe that we can really move things forward. So we're excited about that. And I thank you very much for your time today. And I'll look forward to hopefully connecting with some of you offline. Alan?
Yeah, the only thing I would say is that the future of value assessment is very much about the data and involving patients. And just like so much of science has changed in the last 10, 20 years, so much about the science of patients has changed. So what we know about patient engagement, what we know about what matters to patients, what we know about the patient experience has changed considerably. And it's time to sort of think, sit back and think about how do we mine that advancement in meaningful ways as it applies to sort of the methods and the technologies that we adapt into the healthcare ecosystem. So again, whether that's a quality measure, an outcome measure, a clinical pathway, value assessment, all those things I think can be, the science of those things can be advanced when you incorporate the advances we made in the science of patient engagement and patient experience and what matters to patients.
Great. Thanks, everybody, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alan.